It's my foundation. It's my faith. It's my work ethic. It's my drive. It's everything that I've tried to build for myself that has made me who I am.
I'll do what it takes to make you believe.
Yeah, man, let's get into it a little bit.
Let's do it.
First off, I want to thank you just for doing this. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
You
of
know,
course. Thanks for having me on.
And I found you on TikTok, and it really caught my eye because I've always wanted to talk to someone that was not just knew, about like atheism, but was actually an atheist, and actually like had those beliefs. And so let's like start with that is how did you start to become an atheist and what made you want to believe that there's no God and just those things?
Yeah, I can definitely get into my story just a little bit. But if you look at atheists, a lot of them just say that atheism is a lack of belief in God,
Okay.
right? So it's like, oh, like I'm not actively starting to believe in God. Like they say, everyone's born an atheist, but turn them into religious people over time. Now, I think that definition of atheism is flawed. I don't think that you can just say I lack a belief in God because everyone has some positive beliefs about the world, right? But growing up, my beliefs about the world and religion, I guess I grew up around religious people. I definitely heard where they were coming from, but what I saw was just a lot of religion, a lot of practices. Some people went to church on Sunday, like I went and played soccer or played basketball. To me, it was just like, okay, these people are just, fearing death and, want to feel comfortable about themselves. And I can understand that. Like I wasn't kind of angry towards religious people at all, but really just growing up throughout high school and my whole high school life, there was like two things for me that I was using to explain reality. It was like I really wanted freedom. Like I was just all about freedom, and to me, it was like, okay, if I want freedom, then there's two things I really need to like search after. I need to search after finances, because I see people slaving away at their jobs and trading away their whole life, for a miserable job that they hate. Like, I don't want to do that. So let me figure out how I can get the most finances possible. And then let me learn true ideas about reality because I see people believing false ideas like these religious people. And it quite honestly just seemed like more chains of bondage of, living in, a not true reality. So I was like, all right, throughout my whole high school life, that was just like me looking for freedom in those areas. So I started business and started working on marketing and earning some money there and like buying nice things. And in school, I started studying physics and psychology. And I was like, oh my gosh, I love physics and I love psychology. Like these things tell me true things about reality. Like they tell me about the human psyche, which also was like, oh, like this explains why these religious people believe these certain things. So, they're just like grasping for a father figure, or something of that sort. And just getting acquainted with these kind of ideas. But the main thing was people were talking about the reality we live in and saying that this is how things work. And I was like, man, this is awesome. So I dove into physics, to psychology, and just wanted to continue to, work on that path of freedom, to know true ideas. So I don't have to live in delusion. And continuing with my finances and just really I'm taking the reins on my life at this point in high school. And like, I feel like I'm, doing pretty well. I feel like I'm getting this sense of freedom that I was looking for, like friendships, like people revere me, like relationships, like I feel like I'm doing pretty well on that. I have money, I have these true ideas. And I was like, this doesn't really feel the way that I thought it was going to feel. But you know what, like, screw it. Like maybe I just need more, right? It's always like the idea of like, oh, I just need more. Like when I get more finances or more freedom or like more attention from girls or things of that sort. But then I was graduating high school and I'm like, all right, I consider myself an atheist, someone who thinks that, God does not exist, that there's better explanations for the universe than God. But I had never, so I just put myself in the camp of atheists. Like I'm not a religious person. Anytime a religious person would talk to me, I'd talk to them about physics and psychology and the whole father figure, sky daddy type of like language and terminology.
Right.
But I had realized I'm an intellectually honest person, right? That's what I pride myself on being. Like I'm open-minded and intellectually honest. I follow the facts where they lead, but I've never actually looked into these claims of whether or not God exists. Like I haven't, in the same way that I looked into psychology and physics, I've never looked into why people actually believe in this God. So I was like, all right, I'm about to go to college. I'm gonna pretty much spend the next 4 years of my life continuing that path towards searching for freedom, you know, sexual exploits in college and just getting finances, grades, affirmation. Like I was about to dive into that whole life. So I'm like, all right, if there is this God, maybe I need to figure it out right now because it's going to change the way I live the next 4 years of my life. So I was like, all right, I'll take 3-4 months, disprove this thing. That 3-4 months led into 18 months of taking a gap year and just really hunkering down into studying this question. And in that, I studied the arguments for the existence of God, watched debates, read literature from the past 2,000 years of people talking about these things, 2,000 plus years, just starting the beginning, hearing all these things. And I became convinced that God must exist. Some kind of God exists, but hey, there's so many gods. So like, which one is it? Then I had to go into that and study different like monotheistic, polytheistic beliefs and what do these people are saying. Eventually was like, all right, I'm onto this Christianity one now, but which is the one I see most prevalent around me, at least in speech. But I'm like, okay, this one's awesome because this one's based on a historical event. And that means it's not just like, oh, some guy had a vision and, we started this thing. It's like, even the New Testament writings say if Jesus Christ didn't raise, then your faith is in vain. You're still in your sins. So I'm like, okay, like they really believe that this resurrection thing hinges around the truth of the whole thing. So I studied the resurrection for an extended period of time as well. And, find myself running to conclusions where I was like, man, I think this thing might have happened. And so I see this thing advertised in a church near me called a Watermark Community Church in Dallas. And it's called Great Questions. It's like a ministry for seeking skeptics. I'm like, okay, maybe I'll just go here and tear these people apart and feel like I did something. So with I already knew their stuff. I knew their arguments. I knew their theology. I'm like, I'll go and, just show these Christians that they're anti-intellectual and stuff like that. In that, I go and I ask a question about like God's sovereignty and humans' free will, thinking of being, some, smart guy. And then they intellectually answer my questions with humility and gentleness. I meet with one of the guys after, share with my story with him. And he's like, hey, man, it sounds like you've done a lot of the detective work. You've gathered a lot of evidence over the past 18 months. But good detectives always just draw conclusions. They eventually come to a place where they have to draw a conclusion. He's like, well, do you think you could go back to being an atheist with all the evidence that you have now? Like, no, I couldn't. And he's like, well, what about this resurrection thing? What about this Jesus? Do you think he really rose from the dead? Like, do you think it's, and I was like, but it's not 100% like proof, it's not, I need 100% proof. I need so much, I just needed to be certain. I was so just like holding on to just any little bits. He's like, that's just, not how it works oftentimes. We're looking for the best explanation of the evidence. And faith is not just blind faith. It's warranted true belief. And it's like, you have the warrant and now it's about trusting. Like, what are you going to do? And I was like, all right, I think this actually happened. So I'll just Christian now, whatever that means. And that led into that guy discipling me and just walking with me, meeting me with me every week for the next 8 months. I still talk to him now, maybe weekly. And yeah, all the truth and the freedom that I was looking for. I'm like, oh, truth ended up not being an equation like I was seeking in physics or anything like that. Truth ended up being a person. Because I read the New Testament Gospels and I saw this person claim to be the way, the truth, and the life. Like he was claiming to be that truth I was looking for and the way to set people free. And then he proved it by dying and then raising from the dead. And yeah, that truth and the freedom that I was looking for in finances and, girls and affirmation, like all of that truth and that affirmation all was found in Christ. He gives you the freedom to base your identity in the fact that you're loved by God, you're created in his image, and he is the truth in the sense that if you want to believe true ideas about reality, Jesus says the most true ideas about reality. So yeah, that was kind of just my story through what led me to becoming a Christian. You know.
Yeah, man, and that story kind of makes me think of Lee Strobel,
Mm.
the journalist. You know, I saw a
Yeah.
movie, A Case for Christ, and you know, I always tell people to watch that because this dude was all in, like trying to disprove his wife's faith, and he found nothing.
Mhm.
You know, so it just turned him to make him believe.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I actually work with a guy who claims he's an atheist. I don't think he's one of those that like does the research and digs in to really believe what he believes. But he brought up to me something interesting, that there's a guy that was a Christian and going to school to be a pastor, but then going through all that turned him into an atheist.
Mhm.
So, you knowing both sides, what do you think could have triggered that?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'd have to know that person to know the specific thing
Right, right.
because it's like I'm sure you can find like many stories that are like that. You know, Christians going becoming atheists when they become pastors or something.
Yeah.
You know, maybe that's because they like don't under they never really got to know Christ and they came and got put in this position of like power and they're like, oh man, I have to deceive these people and keep the lights on. Like everyone's got a unique story, so I'd love to like meet that person. But I know maybe he's thinking of a guy named Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is the guy who went to theology school, was raised like a believer in some sense, and the issue for him was just like the fact that there seems to be contradictions or inerrancy in the Bible, and so he started having such a strict definition of like inerrancy. The fact that his whole life he grew up in a strict sect that says like the Bible's a true word of God and it's true in all that it teaches, and then he was reading and seeming like reading these seemingly contradictory things and was like, all right, I can't believe this. But it seemed like a knee-jerk reaction because many people, even at this time, people that grew up along with him, like William Lane Craig, like these people are talk about Bart Ehrman all the time, that he's just overemphasizing minor things. Like
Hmm.
Bart Ehrman didn't believe the resurrection didn't happen. And actually, I quote Ehrman a lot because he's a great New Testament scholar in making my cases for the resurrection. But all in all, I think you'd have to really talk with someone specifically, like on the individual. That's one thing when I'm answering questions. It's always hard to just, talk about things in abstract because it doesn't really connect with persons. I like to go and ask
Right.
questions.
Hmm.
It's if that person says, I'm an atheist now. It's like, well, what do you mean by that? Like, I don't believe in God anymore. Okay, well, like, how'd you come to that conclusion? And it's really just best to ask questions in that situation. But I will say that one's belief doesn't determine reality. Like, if you and I
Right.
start believing that gravity, doesn't affect us the same because of our modern brains or something, or like because we went to the same college, it's like, well, we can believe that. We can really truly believe that and have a warranted reason to think that, but it doesn't change the fact that reality is still there. Just because someone believes that, Christianity is not true, it doesn't mean that Christianity is not true. You have to actually look at the claims of Christianity and have warranted reasons to say that a better explanation exists.
Right. And so how,
Yeah.
because since you mentioned that, that people that he talked about like the Bible's full of contradictions and stuff, how do you answer that question when people will bring that up? Like, how can you believe that if it's telling you one thing in one book and then another thing in another book?
Yeah. Well, the cool thing that I would start with is just asking like, hey, what do you mean by contradiction? Like I also study philosophy. So one of the big things for me as a philosophy student, as a philosopher, is to define our terms. Some people, well, the definition of a contradiction is two things that can't both be equally true. And so a lot of people don't really mean that. What they really mean is differences. There'll be differences in New Testament Gospels, but that doesn't mean that they can't exist because there's usually other explanations that can explain the differences. Usually it comes with studying ancient Near Eastern history or like Greco-Roman biographies and seeing, oh wait, these people didn't write history the way that we wrote history. Like we care about things and we write history the way that we would video something, chronological order, telling data, data, data. But these people were in a time when that's just not how they wrote ancient biographies. They could take different things and like put it in not in chronological order and still be realizing, oh yeah, they're just telling their story, but from their perspective, based on what they want to tell. So it's like, okay, maybe one of the gospels says it happened like this and that, 24 hour, like within a 24-hour period. And another gospel says like that same event happened over 3 days. Well, at first you might think they're contradicting. But when you have that other explanation of the fact that ancient Near Eastern or Greco-Roman biographies write things in different ways than we do write history, then it's not a contradiction because you have evidence to explain the apparent difference.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily now mean that they both can't be true. So I guess people could call these like harmonizations, where you just get a better, more intricate understanding of the scriptures. And then you realize, oh, wait, yes, they're different, but they're just, that's the way that they told history, or that's the certain thing that they were emphasizing. Same thing with like Bart Ehrman brings up all the time, like the woman at the tomb, like who discovered Jesus' body at the tomb, because some of them just mention Mary, Jesus's like disciple, and another sometimes say like, oh, there was another Mary there, Mary Magdalene and Mary, a different Mary.
Right.
But in ancient Near Eastern, like there are these ancient Greco-Roman biographies, sometimes they use a tool called like spotlighting, where they would just highlight like one person specifically, and then that one person, so the one gospel will say it was just her, but then that in that gospel they also have her saying like we saw, that we saw Jesus at the tomb, we don't know what they're gonna do with his body. So they mentioned one woman at the tomb, but then that one woman is saying we, so who's the we?
Right.
So it's just, oftentimes when I was reading the gospels and when I hear people, I always just say like, hey, what contradictions? An easier way to go about this oftentimes is when someone says to you like, hey, there's contradictions in the Bible, how could you believe that? The fastest way, like with gentleness, of course, I seek to handle this is by asking, okay, like which ones? And could you show me one so we could talk about it? And oftentimes like people can't really show you one because they've just heard the slogan of like there's contradictions in the Bible. But if someone actually has a contradiction that they want to talk about, or an apparent contradiction they want to talk about, I say let's go to the verses. And we go and you read the text as a whole instead of just one verse, and you see, oh, this is what they're saying here. Like I kind of get an understanding. So taking a deeper look into the scriptures, getting a better understanding of the historical context, that way we don't commit like chronological snobbery by going back in time and just saying, oh, they should have done things our way. Like we're better, like we wrote better history than them. Just having humility and looking at the text from that way can go ahead and help you deal with those things. But one more point on that. There's a guy that I was studying that kind of had a very similar story to me. His name is J. Warner Wallace.
Okay.
He's a cold case detective. And he was an atheist in his whole life into his 30s, and kind of a similar story to Lee as well. But he's on Dateline NBC, and you can see a lot of his stuff there. He's a super smart dude, and I respect him a lot. And one of the things that he brought up as a cold case detective was the fact that if you're having true eyewitness testimony, like if all of that true, if you have real eyewitness testimony accounts, like what a detective does when they get to the scene is just like say, please keep these witnesses apart, because if you put the witnesses together, you're just going to hear the same story 4 times because they're going to like try to figure out the story, But if you keep the witnesses apart, you're going to hear about the same event in 4 different ways. Some people are going to leave off some details, but that just gives to the credibility of the account. The fact that the Gospels seem to be having these apparent differences add to the credibility of the fact that this is really ancient eyewitness testimony. Like these are people that aren't trying to collude with each other and write a fake story to start some legend. These are people that are just saying, what they saw. And so I think that actual apparent differences in especially the Gospels add credibility to the fact that it's true. And especially when you look at the context of these people's lives and see why they might have said something different, it's overwhelming with the amount of credibility it is. It's not just some fable or story or, fairy tale that people are just coming up with.
Yeah, and I feel
Does that
like
make sense?
people, maybe not just atheists, but like people that don't believe in a higher being or God or anything like that. I think they come up with the same questions, or they bring up the book of Leviticus, that talks about homosexuality, or if you're an adulterer, if you look at a woman the wrong way, God wants your eyes gouged out or something like that. They always bring up that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. Is that something that you hear about a lot?
Yeah. And I think even in like the Christian circles as well, like people will
Yeah.
go to Leviticus. And people will go to Leviticus and say like, oh, like they mentioned homosexuality in here, and like it just shows that it's wrong. And it's like, well, have you read Leviticus? Like it also says, to stone, people that go wrong. Like
Right.
we're hunkering down with these rules because of God was dwelling in their presence.
Yeah.
God's presence of holiness was so strong that if someone was going into God's presence and they were impure, they would be destroyed by that amount of perfection. So they were really hunkering down on because they were with the presence of God, walking in this holiness. Because it just goes to show that because God's perfection is so strong, you really need a perfect level of holiness to even be in His sight, which is already like pointing towards Jesus in the Old Testament. That we do need something that will allow us to enter back into God's presence without being, destroyed in the presence of such perfection. But yes, I do hear that. And even in the Christians that want to go to Leviticus and say like, this shows homosexuality is wrong, but you're not stoning your children when they're, having a relapse and going
Right.
Wrong. It's
Or
like,
if they steal, you're not cutting
choose.
their hand off.
Exactly. So let's not pick and choose. Let's be honest,
Right.
Even in, it's just about having a holistic knowledge and not just hearing slogans. Like even as a young person, it's hard for me to I love to go out and talk with people, but you also have to have some humility in the sense that it takes time to understand these things. Like I know that someone hearing this podcast is, hopefully they just have questions. Hopefully that I can just put a stone in their shoe that they have to deal with. Maybe they haven't been intellectually honest. Maybe they haven't really looked at the other sides of the arguments honestly. And so I'm seeking to do that, to answer these questions as a whole, to get to understand them more. Like you have to just read them. Like there's so many people that I talk to that argue against Christianity that hasn't even read the gospel. Like it doesn't take that long to read the gospel. Just read the gospel. Like listen to Jesus, like just see what He said about Himself. And then we can talk about it, just being humble, being honest, and having that on the Christian side, on the atheist side, all sides, just having that humility of listening and going to the actual text and reading it.
Yeah, it's crazy because I actually grew up in church like 3 times a week. I grew up in Christian school. And for me, I tried to like push God away until just a couple years ago where I fully embraced it. And now I'm deeper in my faith than I've ever been in my life. And so my wife also has started reading the Bible, and she's bringing up these things. She was like, oh, did you know about this? I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Like all these stories she's telling me are triggering in my mind. And it's crazy how much they relate to today's world, maybe in a different manner, but it all comes to the same conclusion pretty much. And it's so crazy, how it does that. And that's why it is important for people to just stick your nose in the word and just like go at it. Just read.
Yeah. Especially, it was kind of funny. I've been reading through Romans very slowly, verse by verse. And if you look at the book of Romans, it answers probably the 20 most common atheistic slogans that you hear. But it's funny because that was like the same kind of stuff they were saying back in the day.
Yeah.
Just like trying to, make a fool of these claims of Christianity. And Paul, being the person he was, the guidance of the Holy Spirit, just was able to answer those questions succinctly and quickly. And so I'd say go read the gospel, one of the gospels, just choose one, and then go read Romans, and then just go from there. Really write your questions down from there and continue to seek it out.
And then there's another one that always the number one question I hear all the time: if God is real, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? Why is there cancer? Why are little kids dying? You know, and I fully understand that. I had a cousin, I was 13 years old, and she died when she was 7. And autopsy came back, there's no explanation to how it was. And I understand how the family felt and everything, but I'm not trying to be like, I'm sympathetic to it, because if it was my kid,
Yeah.
you know, I don't know if I would have faith, to be honest.
Yeah.
It would be tough. So what is your answer to that question? Like, if God is real, why is the world going through what it's going through?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear you. And to cavalierly answer it as just a philosophical question is never the right option. And, you know, for you and your family, like people that are suffering, like do what Jesus did and weep with people, mourn with them. There's a New Testament scholar that I've heard of one of his stories. What's his name again? Madison. I have one of his books around here. I forgot his name, but he was talking about a good experience in his life that he was, you know, getting into like apologetics and studying the Christian faith, and he had a family member that was suffering about, I think her son, was super sick, and he went and gave an answer for, you know, why God can exist and coexist with evil and things of that sort. And she's like, I hear you, but that doesn't speak to me as a mother, you know? And so it's just like having that heart, especially me as a more of an intellectual person, it's easy to just like give an answer, but to be around people that are going through suffering, it's a whole different story. And so like never, ever just treat it like it's a philosophical question, but in those moments, suffer with that person and just say, yes, this world isn't as it ought to be. You know, this isn't how it's supposed to be. But then in time, you can dive into that. What do we mean by it isn't as it ought to be? What is this ought to be? What should it be? Like why? That's what C.S. Lewis. Are you familiar with C.S. Lewis?
Yeah.
That's what he talked about when he was an atheist. He was having these kind of questions too. He was looking at the world and was saying like, oh, this world is so full of injustice and evil. And that's why he doesn't believe in God. But then he's like, what do I mean by injustice? And what do I mean by evil? Like, am I comparing it to some transcendent good, some transcendent way that things ought to be? How could I know a crooked line if I didn't know a straight line? In the sense that, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. In the sense that I always ask people, when you say that you can't believe in God because of the existence of evil, like, what do you mean by evil? Well, they'll give you illustrations. And then I say, okay, don't give me illustrations. Like, what's the definition? And interestingly enough, this problem of evil, bringing it up, allows us to talk about one of the proofs for the existence of God, which is the moral argument for the existence of God, in the sense that if there wasn't some transcendent standard of goodness, then like outside of ourselves, then there couldn't be real evil. It would just be opinions, you know? So does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
So if when you and I say like something is evil, we're saying that it's not the way, it's not good. But what do we mean by good? Like, well, you know, good. You end up getting pushed towards having to say, if real evil exists, that there is some transcendent standard of good in which we're comparing the way things ought to be. And so, interestingly enough, if there is no God, there is no problem of evil. If there is no God, then when people are dying of cancer and starvation in a different country, it's like, why is this happening? Well, why not? You know, if we're all just, you know, molecules dancing to our DNA, if we're all just, you know, living nature out, and we're just, you know, cells and molecules, like, why not this happen? This is what you'd expect, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one of the ways to go about it. Also, as a strict philosophical question, would you say if God was all good and all powerful, then there would be no evil and suffering? Because if he was all good and he could eliminate evil and suffering, and if he was all powerful, he could also do that. But it's actually not a logically sound argument, because there's a hidden assumption that like this is just how it has to be. But if you add another premise into the argument and you say that if there could be morally sufficient reasons for allowing God, or for God allowing this evil and suffering to happen, say like the greater goods that come out of evil, like courage, like you can't really be courageous in a situation if there isn't something to, like some evil that you have to overcome. But yes, as a philosophical argument, no philosophers in the scholarly world anymore really use the problem of evil to disprove God, which is very interesting. As an intellectual problem, you don't find atheists going here anymore except for the emotional charge that it brings, right? Because philosophically, it's not sound. Like the premises don't follow. I mean, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises because there could be morally sufficient reasons.
Right.
And then there's also this aspect of like, there is no problem of evil if God doesn't exist. And there's another aspect besides the personal one, in the sense that I find people often wanting to say like, God, why don't you just eliminate all evil in the world?
Yeah.
Like, just like, why does it have to be this way? But if that was the case, then like you and me and the person asking the question should buckle our seatbelts, because we are that, know. If evil is a privation of the good and the deviation of the good, like you and me, we both know our capacity to do wrong things and evil things. And so if God's going to eliminate all evil, like say goodbye to everything and everyone and you just have a world full of plants and minerals.
Right.
And so people that are asking the question, can't God just make a world where there is no evil and suffering? It's like, yes, he could. He could make a world with just minerals and plants. But to make a world with humans that have free choice, the ability to do evil, no, you can't have that. But then it's like, oh, can't God do all things? God can do all things that are logically possible. It's like, can God make a square circle? It's like, no, that thing's logically impossible. One of the people that I really revere as a philosopher, his name is Dallas Willard. He has this analogy about a janitor in the school that he works at. It's like, you could say to the janitor, like, hey, sweep the floor. And if he doesn't sweep the floor, you could be like, why didn't you sweep the floor? But if you tell the janitor to both sweep the floor and not sweep the floor, and if you go to the janitor and say, hey, why didn't you sweep the floor and not sweep the floor? It's like, whoa, what? What are you even asking? It's because doing that is logically impossible. You can't both do something and not do something. In the same way that God can't make a world of free beings that can choose to do evil, freely choose to do evil, but that they don't do evil. It's kind of like asking the janitor to both sweep the floor and not sweep the floor. God can do all things, but he can only do things that are logically possible. And if God is going to make free creatures like you and me that have the ability to over time become saintly things, that, if, like C.S. Lewis says, if, me and you, like, we look just like mere mortals now, but in our progression, we can one day look like a being that if you were to see him here and now, you just want to break out and worship, really. Right. Like, we have such capacity. God made us as free beings with such capacity to grow, in the sense that we can learn to become people who freely choose to do what is good and trust and live with God, in the sense of growing in our sainthood, growing in what it means to be human. And so because of that, like, God can't just eliminate all evil unless he eliminates us, but he is long suffering and he's patient, just like the scriptures say. God is patient and long suffering with us, so that as many as possible can repent and choose to enter back into this with God life and turn away from their life of self-sufficiency and independence and lostness and brokenness and be with him again. So personally, I'm thankful that God doesn't just eliminate all evil, because it allows for more people to come to him. And God truly couldn't make the world that we live in without allowing for the existence of evil, because we do that evil, Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. And it just made me
I know it's a lot. I know it's a multifaceted answer. But yeah.
But yeah, I mean, but it really makes you think, I always say, God gives us these obstacles to create opportunity. And it's about, are you willing to sit there and cry about what you're dealing with or just do nothing about it, or create an opportunity from it, because God's given you the ability to choose, make that choice,
Mhm.
you know? And then that's all. Whenever I see something in my way, whenever I deal with something internally, I'm always thinking about that.
Yeah.
I'm always like, okay, how can I put a positive spin to this? How can I work with this and do something with this? You know, another example is a girl I went to school with died from leukemia. Her family chose to create this camp in her name for all these cancer kids, and now they work around the country bringing these kids with cancer together to work on their treatments and trying to get them better as best as possible, and they're saving lives doing it.
Mhm.
All because their daughter, struggled from it and passed away from it.
Yeah.
And so they they had that heavy obstacle in their life, and they did something with it that's helping hundreds, if not thousands, of other
Yeah.
people dealing with the same thing.
Yeah. A greater good coming out
Right.
of this apparent evil.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, if you talk to a lot of people in their lives, like a lot of people do come to God through moments of evil and suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's either two ways you can do it. You can say that God doesn't exist, or I reject God, but then you have like no way of dealing with the problem of evil. Or you can turn to God, because God is our burden bearer, like the scriptures say.
Mm.
God is our burden bearer, and he is near to the brokenhearted. And you can turn to God in those moments. I know people personally that have gone through cancer as well, and they turn to God in those moments. And their faith, they learned what it's like to have a real relationship with God, where you walk in dependence on him daily. And so, yeah, I think that the existence of evil and suffering in the world oftentimes does turn out to be good. And even in Romans in the New Testament says that God works all things to the good for those who love him.
Mm.
So it just goes to show that, like, even in the evil and the pain and the suffering that we go through, probably the same thing with the early Christians, right? That were being martyred and killed for their faith. It's like, if this life is all we have, then that doesn't really make sense. But if there is a life, after this, in which all the suffering can be redeemed, then it does make sense. And how can we know God's character? Like, how can we know that he's just not some sky daddy, like away from all of us, just like judging and smiting people? Well, like, look at the life of Christ. I think the biggest comfort for me, and that when I am dealing with suffering and evil in my own life, is to remember God's character. And God's character is shown by the cross. Like, this God is not, like Hebrews says in the New Testament, this God is not just some high priest that's lofty and above us. Like, he could have remained there at the right hand of the Father, but no, instead he came into this world and took on suffering and suffered with us and suffered for us and died for us, so that we could have this bridge to enter back into relationship with God. So it's like, if you want to know if you are suffering, then the best thing to do is to turn to God, because he can comfort you. And how do we know that he can comfort us and that he cares for us? Look at the cross and where he suffered and died for us, showing his character. I trust God's character so much. So now when I am as a Christian dealing with suffering, I don't just turn back to my notes on the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
I look at God's character. I look at God's character in the cross. And I just know that God is so good, because he wouldn't have done that if he was not. And so that's where the cross of Christ plays the biggest role in evil and suffering. And once again, on atheism, like, what is the best that you could say to someone in that situation? Sorry about your luck. Like, it is what it is. Like, evil doesn't really exist. It's like, evil is just a conglomeration of our opinions on what we think is wrong. Nah, like that's where, like, armchair philosophy and stuff like that, where you're just talking about ideas. So it's interesting, because that's what you find, like, debates online, but
Right.
when in a comment sections and stuff. But a real person that's suffering, like, you get to see the reality and the cogency of people's ideologies and worldviews. So yes, the problem of evil is a really big thing, and I don't pretend that it's not. But I think that we have shown that it's not philosophically sound, in the sense that there is no intellectual reasons that God couldn't exist based on the problem of evil. And in fact, the Christian ideology and the Christian worldview offers the strongest solution and the strongest, like, remedy to the problem of evil. So oftentimes the problem of evil, I love to listen and discuss, but ends up becoming a very strong way for people to get to know the character of Christ.
Yeah. And then you brought up an interesting point. Another thing that atheists always talk about is our feeling on death, and how, like you mentioned, how when things go bad, like I think about 9/11, where it brought the country together and people prayed. People that don't even believe in God were praying. So I think that shows them, okay, when things go bad, people pray because they're scared. And Christians believe they go to heaven because it makes them feel better about death. And I know I don't feel that way, but like, what's like the philosophy on it, stuff like that.
On what specifically?
Like like what they say about you feel better because you say you're going to heaven. You feel better about death. I hear atheists bring that up a lot in conversation. Like when I like YouTube like arguments and stuff like that, they talk about where you go when you die or something like that.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll just take one aspect of it in the way that I would deal with it in a certain situation is being like, okay, well, so do you think the resurrection didn't happen? The resurrection of Jesus, do you think that didn't happen? Well, then it's like, no, it's just like, Christians just believe in this sky daddy because, they just want to feel good about themselves and like want to feel some eternal security. I was like, oh, I hear where you're coming from. So do you believe that God doesn't exist? Like those are kind of just fluff questions to me.
Yeah.
Because they didn't say anything about the fact that the resurrection like isn't a historical true fact. They didn't say anything about the fact that God doesn't exist. All they did was attack the character of some people. And those are complaints, not arguments.
Yeah.
And so I will say that like a lot of those comments and those attacks on just it's called like a straw manning essentially. What atheists do is they build up this kind of Christianity that they attack, but so often like you said, like me and you, we don't believe that. And so they build up this straw man and they attack it. It's like, oh, these people are just looking for eternal security. It's like, okay, like, so why do you think that God does not exist? Like, what do you think about this explanation for the existence of God? Like, I that's just honestly where I go a lot of the times, because I don't want to get talking about like things that aren't really talking about truth. But in that situation, are there people that, just see church as their fire insurance ticket from hell? I'm sure they do.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure there is. Like, I know that there is. Does that mean Christianity is not true? Like, no, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that. In the same way, I know one of the other things that people bring up is the fact that, like, hey, Christians are like, there's so many bad and evil Christians. Christians that like, commit rape and then go to church on Sunday, or like there's so many hypocrites and racist Christians that just use the Bible to like hate on people. It's like, yeah, but it doesn't mean Christianity isn't true. And the best way I kind of like to go along with this, if it's easy for the person to follow, is the fact that like, if you have like a work of Beethoven, right? Beethoven, classical music. If you have that work, like its original work, like this is how it's supposed to be played on the piano, say, and you hear that piece being played on the piano masterfully, and it's like they finish and it's like perfect, right? And then you have younger people, you have kids that you're taking to their piano lessons, and they're going to try a little Beethoven and Moonlight Sonata, and they're going to start hitting keys, and it's going to be like, oof, nope, that's not it. And then you're going to find people that have been working on it for a couple of years, and you like play the Moonlight Sonata, and it's like, hey, that sounds good.
Yeah.
But then you have the actual like Moonlight Sonata, like as its original, played by Beethoven, and like that's like the standard of what that's supposed to be. In the same way that Christianity and what it means to be a human is best shown in the life of Jesus. But you have people that are trying to play this tune, but it's their first piano lesson and they never graduate from their first piano lesson. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In the sense that like there is, in the same thing with atheists, there's philosophically articulate atheists that I know and I can have discussions with. And then there's people that troll online, you know.
Yeah.
So it's like in both things, you're going to find the closer deviations to the Moonlight Sonata, Beethoven, and you're going to find very standard deviations. And oftentimes, it's the lack of time, right? It's a lack of time put into it. Kind of like the same thing with the piano. These people have a superficial understanding of what Christianity is, and maybe their pastor does too. And that's where you get into the fact that there's a lot of people that are religious, they do their church activities, but they haven't even read their scriptures yet.
Right.
And then it's about just keeping the lights on in church and attending service, and not being one of the people in your community that doesn't go to church, so you don't get judged. Like, unfortunately, people can be so close in proximity to the truth, but not have it be told.
Yeah.
So yes, I guess that's just how I would deal with it. Just talking about, in the same way that there's atheists that troll online that don't make intellectual arguments, and there's atheists that do try to make good, arguments, and they are honest and have a heart of humility as well. What does that say about the truth of reality? Absolutely nothing.
Right.
But we can still talk about it and deal with it. And it breaks my heart that there's so many people that are, and it hurts Christianity in the sense that, like, people don't really ever argue against true Christianity. Very rarely I find people that have true problems with, like, what Christianity teaches. Many people have problems with Christians and, like, religious activity. So it's very, very unfortunate. But it doesn't say anything about the truth or falsity of Christianity at all, like I said in the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier about, like, say, like, pastors. Like, so I've seen a lot of pastors in the last couple months. Like, one, like, cheated on his wife. One was like, giving therapy to the husband and wife, and ended up she left the husband for the pastor. Like,
That sucks.
And then that gives other people that aren't Christians that leeway to say, oh, look at that. Look what they did. Like, God doesn't exist because of that. And you also hear, one of my things too is when Christians say God hates blank. I'm like, where in the Bible does it say that?
Yeah.
Like, literally, where he says, I hate this. You know what I mean? Because he talks about love all the time. So when it comes to Christians and talking about anything they hate, whether it's like the trans people, the gay people, whatever, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that this is actually, although it seems like a simple answer question, it's a multifaceted in the sense that the fact that we live in a relativistic culture now where truth is relative.
Right.
And so what I find most often is people are redefining the word tolerance. Tolerance, like, I'll definitely, like, find my way to work back into the essential question, but I think I have to go down this for just a second.
Yeah, man.
People oftentimes are defining tolerance now not as what it used to be, which is like hearing another person's argument. Like, for me to be tolerant to you would be to, like, hear your arguments and not kill you and just be like, okay, like, you and I disagree. We're both not saying true things if we're contradicting each other. But hey, we can agree to disagree in the sense that I think you're wrong and you think I'm wrong. And so be it. That's what tolerance used to mean. But now a new definition of tolerance is making its way in the sense that probably you have heard this as well in your experience, that, hey, you and I disagree on something, like me and someone who practiced, a Muslim, right? It's like, if me and a Muslim were in a debate, someone would say, like, in order for there to be tolerance, I have to affirm, and everyone has to affirm that we're both correct. Like, oh, we're both true. You can't say someone's wrong. But the problem with that is, like, okay, like me talking to an atheist, in order for me to be tolerant, it'd be like, oh, well, you have to affirm everybody's belief is true because truth is relative, right? It's true. Christianity is true for you, and that's fine. It's just not true for me.
Right.
These are the kind of slogans you hear. So how does that work when I'm talking to the atheist? Is it true that God exists just for me, but it doesn't exist for the atheist? Like, that doesn't make no sense.
Right.
Like, that doesn't make any sense. If something is true, by definition, like, it's true for everybody. And to say that it's not true, you will contradict yourself. I know that's a little bit of a word puzzle, but like I'll like best explain it in an example here. Like if I was somebody from the modern culture talking about like truth, I would say like, hey, you're telling me that Jesus is the only way to God? Like you can't say that. Like that's unloving. That's bigoted, you know?
Yeah.
That's wrong. Because why? Oh, because you can't make truth claims about everybody. But aren't you making the truth claim that it's wrong for me to say these things? It's like, oh, but wait, it's like, well, I'm just trying to say there is no truth. Like there is no objective truth about reality. Oh, okay. Well, like, is that objectively true? Is that true just for you, or is that true for me too? The problem with do you see what I'm getting at
Oh
here?
yeah, 100%.
The problem is that, and goes into a whole bigger issue, which is what I plan to like write on the rest of my life, is the disappearance of moral knowledge, which is a guy named Dallas Willard who passed away 2013, I believe. But that was his big work, and he's someone I definitely mentor under, in the sense that because truth is disappearing in our modern society, it's hard to argue for anything. Like we saw with the problem of evil. It's like, okay, God's gone, but like these things are evil. What do we mean by evil? Just opinion? So it's not really evil? It's like, oh, shoot. How do I even talk about anything to anybody? How can we say if anything's right? I mean, you're seeing a lot of this with gender and stuff right now, right? If there is no true objective grounding for reality, then we can just say whatever. So that's why I say it's a bigger issue, because it's built on this postmodern ideology of relativism, in the sense that truth doesn't exist. But to say truth doesn't exist is to make a truth claim. And if you build a whole ideology off of a false premise, which you can very easily see that it's false.
Yeah.
There is no objective truth in the world, but that is an objective truth claim. There is no truth, except for the truth that there is no truth. You can't start there. When you start there, that's where you see all these problems in the world. And I think there is a case to be made about Christians. You know, I know that there is a case to be made about Christians that use the Bible to like say like God hates fags, like stuff like that.
Yeah.
But more oftentimes, what I encounter, and I don't like that, and I'll go with you to talk to that pastor, and we'll have a conversation and try to correct that person in the truth, and go to Scripture, and we'll actually start reading this stuff. But more often, what I encounter is someone saying that I am unloving for proclaiming the gospel of Jesus being true, because it's exclusive, right? It says, oh, Jesus is the only way to God. Like, you can't say that. Why? Because I don't say that. It's like, yeah, I know, like we disagree. Like, but now you and I, me and the Muslim, me and the atheist, me and like a social justice warrior, you know, a good-hearted person, we disagree on fundamental things. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Does God exist? And now we both present our case. We both give reasons, a warranted reason for why we believe what we believe. I'll give my spiel on why I think the resurrection of Jesus happened, using like my minimal facts argument that I talk about on my YouTube channel, and they'll say whatever they believe backs their reality. And then we'll talk about those truth claims and see which one holds account. But you can't do that in a culture that says that person's right and you're right, even though they contradict. How can God both exist and not exist? How can Jesus be the Messiah and God in the flesh, and be Jesus, or be the Messiah and not God in the flesh at the same time and in the same way? It doesn't work that way. So getting back to the problem, when people say that Christians are unloving, sometimes they are talking about, you know, the signs that say God hates fags. But a lot of the times when they say that you're being unloving, it's because your worldview, truth claims contradict with theirs, and they don't like that. But instead of talking about, hey, maybe I'm wrong and maybe you're wrong, or maybe we're both wrong, it's like, how do we deal with the fact that their worldview says that we're both right, but also both wrong in this, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yes, that's why I think it's very difficult. The problem of relativism in our culture is making all areas of life, ethics, gender, sexuality, very, very muddy, because like Dallas Willard wrote, this moral knowledge is disappearing. The standard, we're trying to do life and say things as if God exists without God existing.
Hmm.
Frank Turek has a book on stealing from God. Frank Turek is a Christian apologist and author, and he talks about that as well. You know, even in the worlds of science and mathematics and stuff like that, like we're trying to pretend like objective truth exists without something that can ground in objective truth. So yes, that's why this is a little bit muddy of a question. But like I said, like there are people that are being hateful and wrong and going about that. And the best thing to do with those people is find their scriptures and say like, hey, what do you think about this? And how is this congruent with that?
Right.
Like I that's what I would do. But if you're saying that I'm unloving because I'm just proclaiming the gospel that, you know, Jesus Christ is the only way to God and that he's the bridge that builds us back with God, like if I truly believe that, how unloving would it be for me not to tell you that?
Right.
Like it's like one. Are you familiar with Penn and Teller? Have you heard of them? They're like magicians.
Yeah.
Yeah, they like have the show called Penn and Teller Fool Us. Well, Penn Jillette, he's the bigger guy with the ponytail.
Yeah.
He has this. He's an atheist and he's a staunch atheist and all that. But he has this one quote where he says like, he tells a story about how a guy came up to him after a show and gave him a Bible and said, "Hey, I really wanted you to have this." And he completely disagrees with the guy, but he's like, I understand where he's coming from. Like, if you believe that you have the path that people can enter into eternal life, not just in the afterlife, but here and now, the with God life, if you believe all that and you believe that those are in the words of scripture and you don't tell people, like, how much do you have to hate someone not to tell them that?
Right.
You know what I mean? So like, hey, and the fact that I'm telling you the truth, even though it doesn't agree with you, like, it's actually the opposite. Truth by very definition is loving. If you saw somebody about to walk off a cliff because they said, I believe I'm a bird, like the modern ideology of relativism would say that's true for them. That's not true for them. Like it's those kind of situations that like shake you out of it. It's like, so it's true for them that they're a bird and they're going to fly when they walk off the cliff, but it's not true for me. It's like, stop the person. They're going to walk off a cliff and they're going to die.
Right.
Like, just because they believe that this is true, like, doesn't make it true. And that's one of the hard realities you have to deal with when answering these questions. Because if sin, you see how like all these questions are actually really big questions.
Yeah.
If sin and evil is missing the mark, it's taking a deviation of the way things ought to be, like we talked about in the problem of evil. What is the way things ought to be? How do we even know? You know, like if I gave my grandmother an iPad for Christmas and I come back in February and I see that she's using the iPad as a cutting board, and I'm like, Grandma, no, that's not what that's for. You know, like, how do I know what it's for? Oh, it's because Steve Jobs, you know, and his design team, they designed that to be, and they know its purposes because they designed it. So let's take that to humanity. Like, when we see humanity doing stuff, it's like, oh, wait, how do we know like what it's supposed to be for? Like, how do we know its function? Well, we go to its creator, right? Same thing with the iPad. And what does the creator have to say about how things ought to be? And so that's when you go into like the aspects of like, oh, like why is same-sex attraction, and why is adultery, and why is murder, and why is lying wrong? Well, because God intended things to be a certain way, and we're using it in a different way. Same thing with the iPad. Like, that's what it means for things to be evil and to be wrong. Like they're going off of the way that things are supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so it's like, whenever I'm talking about like homosexuality, for instance, very tough subject and not something that can just be dealt with in the abstract with ideas. You have to get to know the person and walk with them and do life with them. So I don't talk about it too much. But in that instance, it's like, hey, if we get to the point where we believe that God exists and Christianity is true and the Bible is the real revealed word of God, like, which cases can be made for all those things. But once you get to that point, it's like, God intended things to be this certain way. God didn't intend me to lust after other women when I have a wife. And God, in the same way, God intended for man and woman to be together. And it's like, you can still like love another and will the good for them, but for the purpose of a marriage, God wrote and God designed for man and woman to be together. And so, like, you're not more heinous and evil and wrong than the person that is still lusting after another woman, even though they have a wife, because both of those people are getting off the track of the way that God intends for reality to exist. And why can God choose? Well, he's the designer. And not just because he's choosing, but because by definition, God is that greatest good that can happen.
Yeah.
And so that's, like I said, this is all, there is multifaceted like things that you could trace with all this. But at the end of the day, the biggest problem that has to be dealt with first is that issue of relativism. And so back to the example of the cliff analogy, if someone's walking off a cliff, it would be unloving of me not to tell that person that they don't have wings and they're not going to fly.
Right. Yeah.
It would be the loving thing for me to do is tell them the truth. And so that brings us to the biggest question that is faced for all humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what is truth? And that's when you get started on the same journey that I got started on, looking at these claims and figuring out what is true about reality. We can't say that there is no truth because I'll be making a truth claim.
Yeah.
So I can start there. Does God exist? We'll look at the arguments there. Who is Jesus? What did he say? He claimed to be God, and he said some things about reality. So if he actually did rise from the dead, like, we can get some clues about reality.
Yeah, 100%, man. And I think it says a lot, coming from someone who started off just having a bunch of these questions, and then you actually did the work and you dug into facts and looking for that truth. And I think even though people out there think they have it all and they don't need anything else, I think deep down they're always still looking for something else.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's how I felt, and I grew up in it, and I didn't realize what it was until later. I was like 28 years old. I'm 31 now. So when I was 28 years old, man, I was lost. I was still doing life, but I was lost, and I didn't know. I was always angry. And I didn't know why, but then once I started digging into the Bible, and, we found a new church, started going to a new church, and just really renewing my faith, renewing my relationship with Christ, and things clicked. And I don't have a worry in the world. Yeah, I'd still have stuff in life I got to go through, but I got someone on my side that I completely trust and have faith in.
Yeah. And even it gives you a way to, like, God doesn't promise us an easy life, but he does promise us an easy yoke. And a yoke, is just how he carries our burdens with us. And in Matthew, where it mentions that, he says, like, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Like, take my way of life upon you and learn from me, because I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's like, that's a promise that our generation, like, needs to hear.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is, and the best thing is, it's grounded in reality. It's not just some, like, hey, go do this meditation. Hey, like, just believe in positive affirmations about yourself. Like, I also had my journey through, like, New Age spirituality in that quest when I became convinced of God's existence, but I was like, I still want to be God for myself. Like, oh, New Age works for that. I can be God and, like, pump myself up and still, like, rule my life. But those things, if Christianity is true, they're not true. And so the best part about that is, if Christianity is true, then you're not just putting your trust in something that's just like a nice idea to get you through life. Like, That's a real thing. And to go to your first point about the fact that you were feeling like so lost and stuff, I think the reason that is, and Christianity says the reason that is because human beings, they were made to dwell with God. Like, in the garden, like, before things got all out of hand, humans and God were made to dwell together. We were always made to dwell in dependence on God. We were supposed to do life with him. We were supposed to walk with him and take his guidance and have his power to do our life. But our brokenness is when we stopped trusting God. We said, hey, maybe we can do things better on our own. That's what the whole biblical, like, Genesis story is talking about. Humans say, I don't trust in God, I trust in myself. Bam. And you break things off of reality. And the same thing you see today, in my life, in your life, and a lot of people's lives, what they're doing is, instead of trusting in God, they're trusting in themselves. Like, what does it mean to sin? Oh, that's an instance when I trust my truth over God's truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I seek self-sufficiency and independence. And so like we experience loneliness and anger and just like lostness. Because why? Like why are we lost? Well, we're missing the necessary component that we need to do life. All humans were never made to do life apart from God, but they choose self-sufficiency and independence, and they seek to be God for themselves. They seek to define what is good and evil for themselves, which is the best way to describe our culture right now.
Yeah.
We're trying to define what is good and evil for ourselves. We're trying to define what gender is for ourselves. We're trying to define sexuality for ourselves. This is the epitome of human selfishness and self-centeredness
Mm-hmm.
and lostness and independence.
Right.
And especially if God exists, then it just goes to show like this is the brokenness of humanity. We're apart from God. We've made this gap, but this is where Jesus plays such an essential role, because he builds, when we broke into that self-sufficient life, like we now have incurred like sin and guilt. Like we're now riddled with brokenness in our heart. We do what is wrong. We do the things that we don't want to do. But Jesus comes and dies so that we can build that bridge to enter back into that with God life, that with God life that we were made for. And when you do that, you not only just get eternal life, but you learn what it means to be human here and now, like you're experiencing,
Mm-hmm.
like God doesn't promise an easy life, but he promises to be with you.
Right.
And you can go through hard things like the problem of evil and say like, I know that this is going to be okay because I know who is running the show. I don't know who holds tomorrow, but I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I know who holds tomorrow.
Right.
And those are true things, not just fantasy ideas. Like those are true things. And this is the kind of life that people were made for, especially my generation being a little bit younger than you. Like I see people just hungering and thirsting for truth, for validation, for purpose,
Yeah.
for just like all these things that come when they enter back into the with God life. You're not beautiful and valuable because you're saying positive affirmations. You're beautiful and you're valuable because you're made in the image of God and God delights in you. That's why you're valuable. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so often my young generation as well, like people in their, teens and early 20s, they'll try this positive affirmation, this manifestation life, or they're just like manifesting their looks and stuff like that. It's like, okay, like for a TikTok video,
Yeah.
it's motivational, but try living that ideology out for the next decade.
Right.
It's not going to work. Eventually the internal inconsistency will kick in and you'll have a major life crisis. And so yes, to enter back into that with God life through the bridge that Jesus builds, like that's what we're made for. All we're doing is going back to being human the way that we were supposed to be. And so, yeah, I think that's just the power of the gospel and the truth of Christianity for our generation. And like I hear from your story, like my own story, like I continue to see God just looks for people to bring into that, he wants this good for us. It just comes to a point where in our life, like you and I, we say, okay, I've been doing things my own way. I've been seeking independence and self-sufficiency. Hasn't worked out. I'm angry all the time. I'm anxious all the time. The things I thought would bring me life, they're not bringing me life. It's like, maybe there's a better way. Why do I feel this way?
Yeah.
And there it is. And that's where the beauty of the true story of Christianity like comes in, because it's not just a true fable, or it's not just a fable. It's not just a nice story to tell yourself. It's not just like a wellness and like mindfulness guide.
Mm-hmm.
It's a true reality that changes people's lives.
Yeah.
It's grounded in truth, and it just so happens to foster and speak to all the deep, heartfelt brokenness that we feel.
Yeah, man, 100%. Is there a place where people can reach you to ask any questions to you or anything like that?
Yeah. So my YouTube channel is really where specifically I get to hear a lot of questions. I also have a TikTok, and it's just Eric Field, EricField. And on YouTube as well, it's Eric Field, or you can search Eric Field Christian Spiritual Formation School. And that's the best place to go. TikTok and Instagram. I have Instagram as well, same hashtag or same username, Eric Field _ But there's so many comments on Instagram and DMs on Instagram and TikTok. I can't get to all of them, but the YouTube channel is the best way. And I'll make videos for people. Like a lot of the times I'll make videos in response to comments that people make, just to give them a full treaty. It's so hard to respond in the comments.
Oh, of course.
I'll do the full effort and I'll just make a full video. I can't do it for everybody, but I'll try it. So.
Yeah, man, I appreciate you doing this, man. You dropped a lot of knowledge on me.
Yeah, I know that there was a lot, but no,
I love it. I love it.
Write down the questions you have and just start dealing with it. And for anybody listening that has that rock in their shoe and they're like, this might be true. Like, and it might speak to the deep brokenness that I feel in my life. It's like, well, pray the prayer that a lot of people pray and that I actually even prayed on my own. God, if you're real, I'm open and I just want to know. So whatever that means, just come in and try to show me. Like, I think that God is just looking for people to like at least be open to that. And to anybody listening that's maybe been an atheist or been in a different religion, and just keep asking questions, and ask God for assistance, because if He's real, I think that He'll come through and help you.
Of course, man. All right, Eric, man, I appreciate your time.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.